The sweltering July of 1852 descended upon North Carolina's coastal plain, with a humidity so oppressive it seemed to transform the air itself into something barely breathable. Heat rising from the sandy soil and from the vast pine forests that covered the region to create an atmosphere that made even minimal exertion feel like wading through water. Conditions that characterized the environment where naval stores production, the extraction of tar, pitch, and turpentine from longleaf pines that covered millions of acres, created a distinctive form of slavery that combined the dangers of forest work with exposure to caustic chemicals that burned skin and lungs, and that killed workers with a regularity that rivaled even the rice plantation's notorious mortality rates. In the slave quarters of Piney Woods Plantation, situated in Bladen County, where the economy depended almost entirely on naval stores production that generated enormous profits for those who owned the forests, and the enslaved people who worked them while creating working conditions so brutal that life expectancy from the moment someone began turpentining operations was measured in single-digit years before chemical exposure and accumulated injuries made them physically incapable of continuing labor. Field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely unbearable levels, and spoke in voices that carried both profound fascination and considerable anxiety about an extraordinary situation that had been developing over the past 18 months concerning a man whose physical presence was so impossible to conceal. Or ignore that his very existence at Piney Woods had created complications that the family who owned the plantation had been struggling unsuccessfully to manage ever since his arrival in January of 1851. According to accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency in oral histories, maintained by descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed events directly and who recognized that what they were observing represented something genuinely unprecedented in how it exposed the tensions between slaveholders' desire for both maximum economic exploitation of workers and complete control over information about their operations. A man named Kofi, who stood 7 feet and 7 inches tall according to measurements that multiple witnesses confirmed, and whose physical presence was so extraordinary that he literally could not enter most buildings without ducking or move through forests without his head extending far above the undergrowth, in ways that made him visible from distances where normal-sized people would have been completely concealed by vegetation, had been purchased in January of 1851 by plantation owner Marcus Sutton from a Virginia trader under circumstances suggesting that the previous owner had been willing to sell someone of obvious economic value at a price that Sutton considered remarkably favorable because Kofi's size created management complications that outweighed whatever labor value his strength provided. From the moment of his arrival at Piney Woods, Sutton and his family had apparently recognized that Kofi's physical distinctiveness would create problems that they had not fully anticipated when making the purchase. Problems that went beyond the normal challenges of managing enslaved workers to involve the fundamental impossibility of keeping his presence unknown to neighbors and to the broader community in ways that slave-holding families throughout the South had learned were essential for maintaining control over information about their operations and about circumstances involving enslaved people that might attract unwanted attention or that might complicate the public performances of paternalistic benevolence that slaveholders used to defend the institution against growing criticism from abolitionists. The complications began almost immediately upon Kofi's arrival when neighboring planters visiting Piney Woods inevitably encountered him and expressed surprised curiosity about someone whose size made him unlike anyone they had ever seen, asking questions about where Sutton had acquired such an unusual worker, and about what capabilities his extraordinary strength provided for plantation operations, and about whether such size came with management difficulties that might explain why the previous owner had been willing to sell him at prices that seemed remarkably low, given the obvious labor value his physical capabilities represented. Sutton's responses to these inquiries were apparently evasive in ways that multiple observers noted, and that created impressions that there existed some situation involving Kofi that Sutton preferred not to discuss openly, though the specific nature of such situation remained unclear from whatever fragmentary information Sutton was willing to provide in casual conversations where direct refusal to answer questions would have violated social conventions governing interactions among North Carolina's planter class, even while complete honesty about Kofi's background would apparently have revealed information that Sutton considered problematic, for reasons he chose not to explain. The challenge of concealing Kofi's presence became increasingly apparent as months passed, and as the impossibility of keeping someone of his size hidden from observation became undeniable. Naval stores work required moving through pine forests that covered thousands of acres, where workers needed to travel between trees to check turpentine boxes and to collect the resinous sap that would be processed into tar and pitch and turpentine. Work that necessarily involved covering substantial distances across terrain, where Kofi's height made him visible from distances far greater than normal-sized workers could be observed. Creating situations where people traveling through the region on roads that passed near or through piney woods forests would inevitably see someone whose size was so extraordinary that they would remember the encounter and would mention it in conversations with others. Spreading knowledge about Kofi's presence throughout Bladen County and beyond in ways that Sutton seemed increasingly frustrated about, but that the nature of the work and the impossibility of keeping someone of such size concealed made essentially unavoidable. According to multiple accounts preserved in oral traditions, Sutton's frustration with the impossibility of controlling information about Kofi manifested in various attempts to limit his visibility that created their own complications, and that revealed the tensions between maximizing economic value through deployment of Kofi's labor capabilities and minimizing the problems that his visibility created. Sutton apparently experimented with assigning Kofi to work in more remote sections of Piney Woods' forests, where observation from roads or from neighboring properties would be less likely. But such assignments meant that supervision became more difficult, and that the efficiency gains from his extraordinary strength were partially offset by the time and effort required to transport him to and from work locations that were deliberately chosen for remoteness, rather than for optimal placement within the plantation's overall operations. Sutton apparently also attempted to instruct Kofi to avoid being seen by travelers or neighbors. Instructions that were essentially impossible to follow, given that his size made concealment impractical, and that attempting to hide whenever anyone approached would have required abandoning work with such frequency that productivity would have been dramatically reduced, creating situations where Sutton's desire for both maximum labor extraction and minimum visibility came into direct conflict in ways that could not be resolved through any arrangement that would satisfy both objectives simultaneously. The situation became more complicated and more visible to the broader community during the summer and fall of 1851, as stories about the extraordinarily tall man working at Piney Woods circulated throughout Bladen County and beyond, spreading through the networks of gossip and conversation that connected rural communities and that made concealing unusual circumstances essentially impossible, despite whatever efforts slaveholding families might make to control information about their operations. The stories that circulated carried various interpretations and speculations about why Sutton seemed so concerned about Kofi's visibility. Some speculated that perhaps Kofi had been involved in violence or resistance at previous locations in ways that made Sutton anxious about his potential danger, but unwilling to sell expensive property that generated value when properly deployed. Others speculated that perhaps there existed family relationships that Sutton preferred to keep hidden from public knowledge in patterns that were common enough throughout the South, where white men's sexual exploitation of enslaved women often produced children whose paternity was an open secret that everyone understood, but that proper social conventions required not acknowledging directly. Still others speculated that perhaps Kofi's previous enslavement involved circumstances that raised legal questions about title, or that might expose Sutton to claims from other parties who might assert ownership rights that would complicate his control over valuable property. Whatever the actual reasons for Sutton's evident discomfort with the attention that Kofi's presence attracted, reasons that apparently remained unknown even to those who observed events most closely, and that Sutton himself never explained in ways that would leave documentary evidence that might clarify his motivations, the situation continued to generate complications throughout 1851 and into 1852 as the impossibility of keeping Kofi hidden became increasingly undeniable, and as Sutton apparently struggled with decisions about how to manage a situation that was not resolving itself through the passage of time as he might have hoped, but that was instead becoming more visible and more commented upon as stories about the giant working at Piney Woods spread through communities throughout southeastern North Carolina. The attention created various forms of disruption to normal plantation operations. Curious travelers would sometimes deliberately route themselves past Piney Woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone whose size had become the subject of considerable discussion and speculation. Neighboring planters would make visits to Piney Woods with pretexts about discussing business or social matters, but with obvious underlying curiosity about seeing Kofi directly, rather than relying on secondhand descriptions that might have been exaggerated. And even people from more distant communities would occasionally appear at Piney Woods claiming various legitimate purposes for their visit, but clearly motivated primarily by desire to observe someone whose extraordinary size had become a subject of fascination throughout the region. Sutton's responses to this attention apparently alternated between attempting to accommodate curiosity in ways that might satisfy visitors and minimize ongoing interest, and attempting to restrict access to his property in ways that would reduce Kofi's visibility, but that also violated social conventions about hospitality and about planter families' obligations to maintain open relationships with neighbors and with the broader community. The contradictions between these approaches created impressions among many observers that Sutton's management of the situation was inconsistent and perhaps even irrational, that his evident anxiety about Kofi's visibility exceeded what circumstances seemed to warrant, and that there must exist some underlying situation that Sutton was working to conceal, but that his own behavior was actually calling more attention to through the very efforts he was making to minimize visibility and to control information about Kofi's background and circumstances. The situation reached a crisis point in July of 1852 when an itinerant Methodist preacher traveling through Bladen County encountered Kofi working in pine forests near a road, and subsequently wrote about the encounter in a letter that was published in a religious newspaper circulating throughout North Carolina and neighboring states, describing the extraordinarily tall Negro man he had observed and speculating about what his life might be like and about whether Christian ministry was being provided to someone whose physical distinctiveness might make him particularly vulnerable to feelings of isolation or alienation from the enslaved community he was part of, but whose size inevitably set him apart from others in ways that the preacher suggested required special pastoral attention. The publication of this letter and its subsequent circulation created exactly the kind of widespread attention that Sutton had apparently been working to prevent. The letter was read by thousands of people throughout the region. It sparked additional correspondence and discussion about Kofi's circumstances in ways that made his presence at Piney Woods known to audiences far beyond Bladen County. And it created pressures on Sutton to respond to inquiries from people who had read the letter and who wanted to know more about someone whose circumstances had been described in published writing, rather than merely an oral gossip that could be more easily dismissed or ignored. Sutton's response to this publication revealed the depth of his frustration with the situation he had been struggling to manage. According to multiple accounts, he wrote an angry letter to the newspaper that had published the preacher's correspondence, demanding that they refrain from publishing any further material about enslaved people on his property, and threatening legal action if they continued to violate what he characterized as his property rights and his privacy rights in ways that interfered with his management of his own affairs. The newspaper apparently published portions of Sutton's letter along with editorial commentary, suggesting that slaveholders who objected to public discussion of circumstances involving enslaved people were revealing anxieties about aspects of slavery's operations that they preferred to keep hidden from scrutiny, creating further attention and discussion that had exactly the opposite effect from what Sutton's angry response had apparently intended to achieve. The complications continued to multiply during the late summer and fall of 1852, as the attention generated by the published correspondence attracted various forms of interest that Sutton found increasingly difficult to manage. Abolitionists in North Carolina and in neighboring states began discussing Kofi's situation as an example of slavery's operations that deserved investigation and public attention, raising questions about his background and about why his owner seemed so anxious to prevent discussion of circumstances that should have been unremarkable if slavery was indeed the benign institution that its defenders claimed. While defenders of slavery argued that the attention being directed at Piney Woods represented inappropriate interference in private property matters, and that abolitionists were using Kofi's unusual physical characteristics to generate publicity that would never have been attracted to typical enslaved workers whose circumstances were indistinguishable from countless others throughout the South. What happened to Kofi during this period of escalating attention and controversy remains somewhat unclear from fragmentary and sometimes contradictory accounts that survived. Some oral histories preserved among descendants of enslaved people who had worked at Piney Woods suggest that Sutton's frustration with the situation eventually led him to sell Kofi to a trader who took him further south, where the attention that had made his presence at Piney Woods so problematic might be escaped through geographic distance from communities where his story had circulated. Other accounts suggest that Kofi may have escaped during this period of disruption, when normal plantation surveillance was complicated by the various visitors and increased activity that the attention had generated. Still, other accounts suggest that Sutton may have arranged something approaching voluntary departure, as a resolution to a situation that had become untenable through providing Kofi with opportunities for escape that technically violated law, but that served Sutton's interests by removing the source of complications that his presence had created. The absence of clear documentary evidence about Kofi's ultimate fate reflects both the general inadequacy of records about enslaved people's lives and the specific incentives that all parties involved had to maintain silence about a situation that had generated unwanted attention. Sutton had obvious reasons to avoid documenting circumstances that had proven so problematic for him. Abolitionists who might have taken interest in investigating what happened may have recognized that excessive attention could endanger Kofi if he had indeed escaped, and that discretion served his interests better than publicity that might enable recapture. And enslaved people who knew details about what happened understood that sharing such information openly could create dangers for everyone involved, and that maintaining strategic silence protected vulnerable people better than satisfying historical curiosity. The broader significance of the situation that unfolded at Piney Woods during 1851 and 1852 extends beyond the specific details of one man's circumstances to illuminate fundamental tensions in how slavery actually operated, despite defenders' claims about masters' absolute control over their property and their operations. The story demonstrates that physical realities could complicate slaveholders' ability to control information and to manage public perceptions in ways that exposed vulnerabilities in the comprehensive authority that slavery claimed to possess. That individual enslaved people's characteristics could create situations where maximizing economic value through labor exploitation came into direct conflict with minimizing public attention in ways that created dilemmas with no satisfactory resolution. And that the networks of communication and gossip that connected rural communities made concealing unusual circumstances essentially impossible, despite whatever efforts slaveholding families made to control information about their operations. The story also reveals how slavery's operations depended not just on the violence and legal authority that received most attention in discussions of the institution, but also on slaveholders' ability to control information and to manage public perceptions about how enslaved people were treated, and about what circumstances existed on particular plantations. Control. That was essential both for maintaining the public performances of paternalistic benevolence that defenders used to counter abolitionist criticism, and for preventing the kind of specific attention to individual cases that might generate sympathy or outrage that abstract discussions of slavery as an institution could more easily deflect. When physical realities made such control impossible, as Kofi's size made it impossible for Sutton to conceal his presence or to prevent public discussion of his circumstances, the resulting complications demonstrated how dependent slavery's smooth operations were on mechanisms of information control that slaveholders generally took for granted until situations arose that made such control unachievable. And sometimes, according to stories that were preserved across generations by those who had witnessed how one man's extraordinary physical presence created complications that exposed tensions between slaveholders' desire for maximum economic exploitation and their need to control public attention and information about their operations. Slavery involved not just the routine brutality and exploitation that characterized the institution's normal functioning, but also situations where physical realities made concealment impossible despite slaveholders' best efforts, and where the resulting public attention created pressures and complications that challenged the absolute control that slavery claimed to provide over both enslaved people themselves and over information about how they were treated and about what circumstances they experienced. The man who stood 7 feet 7 inches tall and whose presence at Piney Woods during 1851 and 1852 became impossible to keep hidden despite the evident anxieties of the man who claimed to own him, demonstrated through the situation his size created that slavery's comprehensive control was actually more fragile and more dependent on successful information management than the institution's defenders wanted to acknowledge. That individual characteristics could create complications that no amount of violence or legal authority could resolve when physical realities made concealment impossible. And that the attention such complications attracted could generate exactly the kind of public scrutiny and discussion that slaveholders generally worked desperately to prevent, because such scrutiny threatened to expose aspects of slavery's operations that defenders preferred to keep hidden from audiences whose support for or tolerance of the institution might waver if they understood too clearly what slavery actually involved in practice, rather than in the idealized abstractions that public discourse about the institution generally maintained.